Today we'll be testing the GTX 970 in Cyberpunk 2077. So our total system specifications is we've got a 12400 CPU paired with DDR4 3200 MHz CL16 memory. And that's pretty much it. We're running Windows 10 because the 12400F does not have E-cores, so we don't need the enhanced scheduler of Windows 11, but that's pretty much it. Right, so what we are going to be using is we're going to be using the low preset, but I'm going to disable FSR, and then we are going to test it at 720p. The upscaling tests will be later in this video. And as usual, we are starting just outside of V's apartment, outside of Mega Building 10, one of the 4 apartments that you can acquire in this game. Well, this is the one you start with. And as you can see, we've got our performance metrics there in the top left-hand corner. So what we've got is we've got the temperature, the GPU usage, the GPU clock speed, the GPU power draw, as well as the voltage. Then we've got VRAM usage and VRAM clock speed. And there's the CPU performance numbers as well. So you can see that it's running at about 4 gigahertz all core. Then we've got our memory usage, our DDR4 RAM usage, and then we've got the frame rate. And if we, that's the wrong button, and then if we press this button, then we start seeing the averages, the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows as well. Below that there's a frame time graph, and that would indicate any stuttering. Right, so right off the bat we are getting about 55 frames per second here. It goes to about 60 every now and again. There's not a lot of stuttering that I've noticed yet. You can see there from the frame time graph and the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows. It seems to be pretty smooth, not very fast, but slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Right, so it seems okay. Let's see what happens if we start a gunfight here. I managed to find some ammo. In my previous video I ran out of ammo, so the reason why I'm testing outside of this specific location is because it is very intensive on both the CPU and the GPU. There are also quite a few cops here, so it's just easy to pick a fight. Right, some of these cops are quite tough. And I think I ran out of ammo again. I should have gotten more. The game actually feels very good. I mean, I just shot his head off. He's still fighting. I don't know what that's about. Anyway, so the game feels pretty okay, even though we're not getting a constant 60 frames per second. To be honest, I expected a little bit more, especially at 720p. If you've seen my Warzone 2 video, I mean, Warzone 2 came out at the end of 2022, and Cyberpunk came out at the end of 2020, and this game actually plays a lot worse than a modern AAA game. And we just died, so we have to reset our numbers here. Unfortunately, but I mean we did get an average of about 55 frames per second, which is not bad. It's definitely playable, and the game doesn't look too bad even with the low preset with the FSR disabled. I think if you've got an older card like the 970, this is definitely doable at 720p. Alright, but let's see what happens at 1080p. Right, as you can see, we're now at 1080p, and I just wanted to show you that I do have my crowd density at low. I play on low, especially with these older graphics cards. Right, so now we are back and we just reset these numbers, and our frames per second almost halved. We are getting about 30 frames per second, so console-like experience. I mean, it's not a terrible experience, it's just for this game, I would definitely rather play at 720p if I have to play at native resolution, but we'll see what FSR can do to help save us here. Right, as per usual, let's try and shoot some people. The input latency has increased quite a bit, so I'm blaming that for all my missed shots. I just killed 2 police officers outside of the police department, and there's no cops in sight. Right, anyway, let's just drive around a bit. Driving around in this game is a little bit more intensive, so let's see what the frame rate does once we start driving. It's pretty difficult to handle a car if you have a little bit of a input latency, but surprisingly the frame rate stays stable at about 30 frames per second, so that's pretty decent. You can see that the lows are proportional as well. Not a lot of stuttering going on here. And for those who are wondering, in my previous video, the CPU was running quite a little bit hotter. It was because it was running on the stock cooler that came with the CPU. And I've recently just installed an AIO on it. Alright, that's enough of 1080p. As you can see, it's a solid 30 frames per second experience. The lows are very good as well when compared to the average, and I didn't notice any stuttering. So all in all, I think it's quite acceptable, especially considering that this card is now 8 years old. Alright, but let's see what it does at 1440p. I've got no hopes, but we have to test anyway. Alright, so now we're at 1440p. Everything else is still exactly the same. We've got no ray tracing, obviously. And right, let's see what happens. I'm just going to reload my save game. Right, and here we are at 1440p, and I must say I expected a much bigger drop in performance. We lost about 10 frames per second. I mean, percentage-wise, it's quite high. This is not a much worse experience than what we had at 1080p, and you can see that the game actually looks quite nice. So as I said, we're getting about 10 frames per second lower, so that's about 30% lower than what we had, and that's definitely noticeable in the input latency. I'm not sure I'd be able to hit anybody running around, and the frames per second dropped quite a little bit there just by zooming in and shooting. And now that the police arrive in full force, now you can see that the frames actually dropped quite a bit. Right, this is getting quite difficult to shoot people, so I might as well just go melee. I think it's a little bit more effective if you've got lower frames per second. Maybe, maybe not. Anyway, this is not going well for me, but that was to be expected. And as I said, we're just going to blame it on the low frame rate. Alright, let's see what happens if we drive around a little bit. So even though the frames per second drops quite a bit, it's still not stuttering. There's not a lot of hitches or micro stutters or whatever you refer to it as. Those would be visible in the frame time graph as big spikes, but you can see that the frame time graph is actually pretty smooth. I mean, it goes up and down quite a bit, but it's not heavy spiking. And driving around, we're still getting about 20 frames per second or so. And I think that's where we're going to leave it for our 1440p testing. I don't know if we should test at 4K. I'm just going to go into 4K and go back immediately. Alright, so we're at 4K. I increased the size of the on-screen display for MSI Afterburner so that we can see. In the previous video for Warzone, I did not increase the on-screen display size. Sorry about that, but the game has some issues. If you alt-tab out of the game, some textures don't load when you go back in, but Cyberpunk does not have that issue. Right, and let's start our frame counter here, and this is good. I mean, it looks pretty good. You can't play it, but I'm pretty sure that if you stand still, then the game would be very, very nice. Right, we got 10 frames per second here. I'm pretty sure we are maxing out our VRAM. This GTX 970 was advertised as having 4 gigs of VRAM, when in reality it only had 3.5 gigs of VRAM, and you can see there that the VRAM allocated is already 4 gig. Now the VRAM usage might differ from the actual allocation there. I'm just going to come out and say it. If you've got a 970, then don't try and play Cyberpunk at 4K. Right, so we just reloaded our save game, and now we back at 720p, but now we are testing with the FSR 2.1. The preset we are using is still low. I'm just manually setting the FSR to quality. Right, so let's see. That looks atrocious. I can't see anything. I'll be right back. Alright, that's a little bit better. Let's reset the numbers here. Now you can see we are getting about 60 frames per second. That's actually pretty okay. The game feels a lot better. You can see the frame times are around 16 to 20 milliseconds, and that's actually very, very good. It's definitely playable. The input latency is not as bad. And zooming in still drops the frames to below 50, which is not ideal. I mean, it's to be expected. As I said, this card is 8 years old, and when there's not a lot of action happening on the screen, you actually do get a 60 frames per second experience. Right, I don't think I'm gonna win this fight, so let's just drive around a little bit. Driving around, you can see that the frame rate drops a little bit. It drops below 60 more often than not. But once again, the frame time graph is actually very stable, very smooth, indicating that there's little to no stuttering going on. So that's a win, I think. I've got this connected to my 1080p monitor as well, and glancing over to it, the game actually looks okay. If you've got a 1080p monitor, then 720p with FSR quality is definitely doable. But let's see what we need to do to get a constant 60 frames per second experience. We're going to switch FSR to performance. The game is going to look terrible because now we are lowering the internal resolution, but what we are after is just frame rates. Right, so we gained very little and we lost quite a lot in the visual quality. Yeah, it's still not a constant 60 frames per second experience. Although our highs increased quite a bit, so you can see that sometimes we're even in the 70s. And let's just fight a little bit, see if it still drops if we zoom in. So it drops to just below 60 every now and again. So we probably gained 10 frames per second or something. The input lag is pretty much the same as previously. That's because our average is pretty much the same as previously. But as you can see, when there's not a lot to be rendered, you almost get 80 frames per second, which is commendable for this old graphics card. And I mean, the game doesn't look terrible. My 1080p monitor is a 24-inch monitor, so the pixel density is actually quite high, and over there it looks not too bad. Alright, but I think that's it. I'm just going to test 1080p as well with FSR balanced and see what the performance loss is. Right, so we're at 1080p with FSR balanced, and we're getting about the same as what we got with the 720p native. I mean, that makes sense. I don't remember the resolution scaling off the top of my head, but I think it upscales from either 720 or just one resolution lower when balanced is enabled. I might be wrong on that, so don't quote me on that one. But I mean, this is playable. It's not terrible, except for the minor spikes in input lag. I don't think this is the worst experience I've had with this game. I mean, this game came a long way since launch. Back then, this is pretty much the performance you got on a 1080 Ti, more or less. I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit, but not a lot. Alright, so as I lay here dying, I think we're gonna call it. So that's it. If you've got a GTX 970, you want to play Cyberpunk, I would suggest playing at 720p with FSR quality. Or if you have to play at 1080p, then even FSR balanced on 1080p is not the worst that you can do, although you don't get your constant 60 frames per second. Alright, and that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.